It was November 9, as you all know, 1989, and the world watched in amazement as East Germans streamed through and over the Berlin Wall to cross into West Berlin. Berliners on both sides of the city were celebrating atop the wall. And the collapse of this iconic symbol of the East-West divide was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a series of political upheavals throughout the region that year. Taken together, they marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire and the Cold War, and I guess I would argue the true end to World War II. We could trace the birth of the European Union and actually the current political turmoil in Europe directly to those events. So joining me to discuss all this is a distinguished panel of journalists who are on the ground for this revolution. I know many of you were too, so I'll introduce them. We'll have some group discussion with the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the audience so that you can also tell your stories and make your observations about how we should think about this 30 years later. Andy Nagorski, my dear friend, was born in Scotland to Polish parents, moved to the United States as an infant, and has rarely stopped moving since. He spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent, an editor for Newsweek in Hong Kong, Rome, Bonn, Berlin, Warsaw, Moscow. During the upheavals of 1989 to 90, he traveled back frequently to Central and Eastern Europe, reporting for Newsweek and other publications. He's also the author of 7 books, most recently, 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War, which you probably could recommend or even sell while we're here.
Buy early and often.
Jonathan Kapstein spent 48 years abroad as a foreign correspondent, 22 of them for Business Week, my alma mater as well, where he was posted to South America, Canada, Italy, and Africa. His articles have appeared in U.S. News and World Report, The Nation, The Reporter, Commercial Aviation News, New York Newsweek Day, and many, many others. Born and raised in Providence, Rhode Island, like my husband. John is a graduate of Brown University and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He's held a fellowship in international reporting at Columbia and was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. Thank you for your service. My dear friend Carol is president of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit media organization covering criminal justice in the United States. Founded in 2014, the Marshall Project has published more than 1,000 stories with media partners, ranging from the New York Times and Washington Post to the Jackson, Mississippi Clarion Ledger. Its Pulitzer Prize-winning story about a rape investigation gone terribly wrong was recently made into one of the most popular Netflix series of the year, Unbelievable. Carol worked for 20 years as Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch for Media. She covered the fall of communism from Moscow, where she was a correspondent and then bureau chief for Newsweek magazine from 1989 to 1993. And John, you're going to have to help me. Danishevsky became vice president for standards and editor-at-large for the Associated Press in July 2016, after more than a decade leading its international news department as international editor, senior managing editor, and vice president for international news. Prior to that, he spent 20 years as a reporter, editor, and correspondent for both AP and the Los Angeles Times. He's worked in more than 70, that's amazing, countries, including postings to Warsaw, Johannesburg, Cairo, Moscow, Baghdad, and London. So thank you very much to our panel, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us. Andy, I'm going to start with you. There's a modern misconception, I think, that when the wall between East and West Berlin was breached, that led directly to the collapse of communism. But it's quite a bit more complicated than that. Can you give us the context of what happened in 1989 and in the years before and after?
Sure. Do I have the song?
I think you push the button on the bottom.
Okay. No. My technical skills. Okay. All right. Yes, that's okay. Thanks. As most of you know, certainly by the 80s, the failures of that system in the Soviet Union and the whole, what was called the Soviet bloc, were so evident to everyone, yet there was this feeling of what's ever going to change. I remind you, I happened to be living in West Germany, based in Bonn, in '87 when Reagan made that famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I remember when it was made, you could almost hear the snickers of many people in Bonn and elsewhere saying, you know, who is this crazy American thinking that the wall can fall? And even the activists in Eastern Europe, in Solidarity, Charter 77, and so forth, felt, yeah, they weren't working on the assumption that everything was going to change that quickly. But what had happened in brief was, you know, of course, there were the failed violent revolutions like the Hungarian Revolution. There was workers' protests in East Berlin in the 50s, and then shipyard protests in the early 70s in Poland. There have been all these attempts at change, and everyone had been suppressed either by Soviet tanks or by local tanks and local police. And by the 80s, there were increasing number of movements that were challenging the system from within, ground up. Of course, Solidarity in Poland was inspired in part by John Paul, the election of a Polish pope. You had Ronald Reagan challenging the Soviet Empire as never before. And then later you have Gorbachev coming on the scene. And this is, I'm sure Carol will get to this, the whole question of what was Gorbachev's vision. In brief, my take is that he thought you could reform and tinker with the system, but save it. And I think he helped destroy it by trying to save it that way. But by '89, I think you have, I compare this a little bit to like a 5-act play. Act 1 is in Poland. Poland, everything has, there had been martial law in the beginning of the 80s. The attempts to just keep suppressing Solidarity, get the economy going, all of that failed. The shortages of the system could not be believed. Shortages of everything from foodstuffs to the most basic commodities. The failures of the system were evident, and the demoralization was evident. And I remember talking to one of the Politburo members later and said, we were a bit like in the situation where you're in an airplane and one engine goes out, then another engine, and pretty soon all the engines are out, the landing gear is stuck, and we're trying to land this damn plane. And they decided that at that point, we'll negotiate with Solidarity, which we outlawed, and tried to eliminate. But they thought, oh, we have this clever thing. We'll arrange a deal where we'll allow them contest a minority of the seats in Parliament so they'll feel good, but of course we'll retain the majority. Well, as the polls later said, this was trying to remain a bit pregnant. It didn't work out because once you allowed partly free elections, which Solidarity just wiped the communists off the map, the electoral map, they won everything. Even the so-called sister parties of the Communist Party defected. They realized their careers were over if they didn't jump. And pretty soon in Parliament you had a Solidarity majority and the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe. The effect on the region was huge. That was the elections were in June. Yeah. Government was formed. Yeah, it took a while to form the government. The communists tried to form a government first and failed. So imagine, so what is the next step? Act 2, I'd say, is Hungary, next door. The Hungarian Communist Party always prided itself as being more reform-minded, a little bit more better in economic management, and it was true. But they were being left behind. So what do? They take the symbolic step of taking down the Iron Curtain between Hungary and Austria, which means actually cutting the barbed wire, having the foreign minister of both countries doing it. What people forget is that Hungarians had been allowed more leeway, and they were allowed to cross into Austria anyway. But what this meant was that East Germans who were trapped within what was called the socialist bloc could go to Hungary. That they could not travel to the west, but they could go to Hungary, and then they could go right across the border. And it's suddenly like this sucking out of population from East Germany. The East Germans were furious, but the Hungarians didn't want to be seen as the folks who were bucking the trend towards a more open system. So that happens. Then, of course, there's the Berlin Wall, where once all those people start leaving, the East German authorities are in total panic. And almost by accident, they announce there's free travel, and everyone says, oh, yeah? Okay, I'm out of here. And that was November 9th in very simplified form. Act 4 happens in Czechoslovakia and Romania. In December, Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution, Václav Havel. The dissonance there was a much smaller movement than Solidarity. But the outburst of the psychological barriers had been stopped. The outburst of activism reached there. They topple the Czech regime and Romania. And here, John and John Tagliabue can tell you much more about it. The one violent revolution takes place in Romania in December, and then finally, the Soviet Union, I say, was Act 5. It's amazing. But one thing, I just make one more remark about this: the psychological transformation was huge. And for me, there's that one anecdote that captures it. After the Polish elections, these Solidarity activists who had been meeting secretly in the mountains with some of the Czech activists decided to go as parliamentarians now suddenly to Prague and to visit Havel and others. And Havel invites this group of Polish newfound parliamentarians to his country house. And this being Czechoslovakia, there's a long dinner, a lot of beer flows. And at a certain point, some people are getting restless and say, Václav, we got to relieve ourselves somehow. And he says, I have an idea. You see outside our house, all those cameras pointed in? We're going to go relieve ourselves right there. And all these guys marched out and relieved themselves for the cameras. At that point, the communist system is clearly not seen as the threat it once was.
That's a great story.